welcoming our distinguished University Professor Ram Guha. He of course needs no introduction. He's one of the foremost public intellectuals in the country, has written extensively and very insightfully on modern and contemporary India, its architects, on environmental history, and if I may be forgiven for saying so, most innovatively on cricket, the often ignored insight. And now, without much ado, Professor Ram Guha.
Thank you. Thank you, Preeti, and thank you all for coming here. So I'm going to speak on the title of my talk, What's Left of Jawaharlal Nehru? And it's going to be, the talk is going to be in three parts. The first part will speak of how, while he lived, and particularly while he was Prime Minister, Nehru was widely and almost universally adored by Indian public. The second part will explain and try and understand how his reputation started to decline and then began to precipitously fall, so that there are few admirers of Nehru left outside the inner circle of the Congress party. And the last part will move beyond how Nehru was viewed in his lifetime and later, and talk about a kind of historian's assessment, an assessment by a historian and a Democrat. I mean, I don't really like the word public intellectual. I don't mind if people use it of me, but I'm a historian and a Democrat. So obviously I'm a scholar, but I have some values, and essentially democracy and pluralism are the values I kind of adhere to. And so what was Nehru's contribution in nurturing democracy and pluralism as viewed by a historian, not by a Nehru Bhakt or a Nehru critic, so based on research and evidence. So these are the three parts of my talk. And I'm going to begin with a statement made by a 19th century British writer called Edward Carpenter, who's probably very largely forgotten now, but was a fascinating figure. He was, among other things, an early environmentalist and an early advocate of gay rights. So he was from an elite background. He studied mathematics in Cambridge. But then he fell in love with a working class man and set up a home with him in Sheffield, which was an industrial town in northern England, and spent his life with this male partner, working class partner. But of course, at a time when not only was homosexuality illegal, it was widely stigmatized and regarded as unnatural and all kinds of other things. So he was also an early environmentalist. He was living in Sheffield, which was an industrial town, and there was high levels of pollution. And he started one of the first smoke abatement societies in Sheffield in the 19th century. At a time when environmentalism was deeply unfashionable because it was regarded as impeding progress. And environmental concerns like trying to control pollution in the 19th century England was opposed by the elite because they wanted profits, but was also opposed by the working class because they felt like they were getting jobs in these factories. Right? So he was a prophet of several things, including environmentalism and gay rights in the 19th century. He was also, by the way, a great influence on E.M. Foster, who admired him for living with the man he loved, whereas E.M. Foster was, in Cambridge and too like nervous to openly, come out as gay. And Carpenter once said, he said, the outcast of an age is the hero of another. And I think there's an element of self-projection, thinking of himself. Here I am in the 19th century, mocked for being gay, mocked for living with a working class man, abused for opposing industrial pollution. I'm an outcast today, but maybe I'll become a hero later on. People will recognize that I was ahead of my time. And when I think of Carpenter's statement, and the outcast of an age is the hero of another, I think Nehru's life exemplifies the reverse. He is the hero of his age who has become the outcast of our age. Now, so the first two parts of my talk will be about that. How he was the hero of his age and how he's become the outcast of ours. You know, it's hard to imagine how hugely admired Jawaharlal Nehru was in his lifetime. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of this. I was speaking with a friend who is about 10 or 12 years older than me, who's a very learned and scholarly Indian, and I won't take his name, but some of you would have followed his writings. He's in his late 70s now. And we were chatting about Delhi in the 1950s, because I knew Delhi in the 1970s. And he was talking about Delhi in the 1950s, what it was like growing up in Delhi. And he said, in passing, while describing Delhi in the 1950s, he said, you remember Delhi, you won't know because you're too young, but Delhi in the 1950s, when Pandit ji was a great golden disc shining in the middle of Delhi. So that was kind of Nehru in Delhi in the 1950s. And but to this anecdotal statement by a friend, I'm going to quote you some contemporary accounts of how extraordinary the adulation and affection was for Nehru. And I'm going to read to you some accounts of the 1952 general elections, which were the first elections held in India. And next year we'll have the 18th general election. And Nehru was traveling the country campaigning for his party, the Congress party. Between October 1951 and January 1952, Nehru covered the country from end to end. He travelled 25,000 miles in all, 18,000 by air, 5,200 miles by car, 1,600 miles by train, and even 90 by boat. A breathless party functionary later described Nehru's election campaign as comparable to the imperial campaigns of Samudragupta, Ashoka and Akbar, as well as to the travels of Fa Hien and Yun San. In the course of this campaign, wrote one observer, Nehru travelled more than he slept, and he slept and talked more than he travelled. He addressed 300 mass meetings and myriad wayside ones. He spoke to about 20 million people directly, while an equal number merely had his darshan.
Sorry, just continue this call.
So, he spoke to about 20 million people directly, while an equal number merely had his darshan, eagerly flanking the roads to see him as his car whizzed past. Those who heard and saw him speak included miners, peasants, pastoralists, factory workers and agricultural labourers. Women of all classes turned out in large numbers for his meeting. This is how a contemporary account described the interest in Nehru at the time of the 1952 general elections. I quote, almost at every place, city, town, village or wayside halt, people had waited overnight to welcome the nation's hero. Shops and schools closed. Milkmaids and cowherds had taken a holiday. The Kisan and his helpmate took a temporary respite from their dawn to dusk program of hard work in field and home. In Nehru's name, stocks of soda and lemonade sold out. Even water became scarce. Special trains were run from out-of-the-way places to carry people to Nehru's meetings, enthusiasts travelling not only on footboards but also on tops of carriages. Scores of people fainted in milling crowds. Now, that's the kind of adulation Nehru was held in. And this had been the case for a little while before 1952. This is the 1952 elections. But Nehru's kind of popular appeal goes back to the mid-30s. And I may say a little bit about that later. And in 1937, when elections were held under the 1935 Act, the British still ruled India. For the first time, there were elections held in which Indian parties could compete and run the provincial governments. So Congress won 7 out of 9 states and so on. And one leading congressman described Nehru, he said, and since cricket was mentioned by PT and the Cricket World Cup is on, he said, Nehru is the Bradman of the Congress. The Bradman is like Tendulkar or Kohli or whatever. He said, Nehru is the Bradman of our party. Right. Now, but it was not just in India and by Indians that Nehru was so greatly admired. So I've given you some quotations, contemporary press accounts of the 52 election, and now I'm going to give you a tribute paid to Nehru by a British newspaper, The Guardian, in 1957, when Nehru was in London and he addressed a press conference in London. The Guardian remains a very well regarded and well respected paper, and a British paper with a kind of very much of an international outlook. It doesn't have a parochial or provincial outlook. So Nehru addressed this press conference in London in 1957, and afterwards there was a report in The Guardian which was an account of the press conference addressed by Nehru, and it said 100 men and women of the West, because they were all the leading journalists, including French and German journalists, there to listen to Nehru. 100 women and men of the West were being given a glimpse of the blazing power that commands the affection and loyalty of several 100 million people in Asia. There is nothing mysterious about it. Nehru's power is purely and simply a matter of personality. It is as intangible as that. Put in its simplest terms, it is the power of a man who is father, teacher and older brother rolled into one. So I'll repeat that. It is the power of a man who is father, teacher and older brother rolled into one. The total impression is of a man who is humorous, tolerant, wise and absolutely honest. Now, The Guardian is not a, it's not a Congress party paper. It was a serious, rigorous, objective British paper. The British pride themselves on their objectivity, their cynicism, their dispassion. And here is The Guardian saying, the total impression is of a man who is humorous, tolerant, wise and absolutely honest. Now, these tributes that I am reading out here, I'm going to read out many more from the 40s and the 50s, are absolutely laughable from the perspective of 2023. What is said and heard and discussed about Nehru today, are they talking about the same guy? Who is mocked and derided and abused and made fun of 100 times a day by politicians, by on social media and so on and so forth. So how is this? How did the hero of his age become the outcast of us? And this happened long before 2014. I mean, I'd like to make that clear. This decline in Nehru's reputation really starts in the 1970s when his daughter Indira Gandhi is Prime Minister. That's when the decline starts. And I'll say a little bit later about the ways in which Indira Gandhi differed from Nehru as Prime Minister, but that will come later. But Indira Gandhi's Prime Ministership, and particularly the emergency and the political changes that ensued after the emergency of 1970 or 77, really begin the decline of Nehru's reputation. And it's continued ever since. But as Indira Gandhi was succeeded by Rajiv Gandhi as Prime Minister, head of the Congress, and then after a hiatus of nearly 7 years, Rajiv Gandhi was succeeded by Sonia Gandhi, and then Sonia Gandhi was succeeded by Rahul Gandhi and so on. Now, about 15 or 20 years ago, when Sonia Gandhi was maybe about 2005 when the Congress, UPA was in power, and I was sitting with one of the Indian intellectuals I greatly admire, the sociologist Andre Bete, who despite his French name is actually wholly Indian, half Bengali, half French and wholly Indian, and has been a great personal influence on me. And I was chatting with him, and he said, he was talking about the attacks on Nehru and how Nehru was so unpopular. Andre Bete had grown up in Nehru's heyday. He was born in 1934 and he grown up in the 40s and 50s. And he said, Nehru's posthumous career is the reversal of the biblical injunction. In the Bible it is said, the sins of the father will be visited on 7 successive generations, and in Nehru's case, the sins of 7 successive generations have been retrospectively visited on Nehru. Now, it's a profoundly original remark which he said to me in conversation, and I have used it today and in the past. But I would say, since I'm a scholar, always attribution. I don't claim to have made it up. It's my teacher and guru Andre Beke who came up with this incredibly wise remark that, in the Bible it says the sins of the father will be visited 7 successive generations. In Nehru's case, it's the sins of 7 successive generations that are revisited on Nehru. Now, the decline in Nehru's reputation begins with the emergency and the victory in 1977 of the Janata Party. Now, for an audience of young people, I should say a little bit about the Janata Party. So, India became independent in 1947. From 1947 till 1977, 30 years, one party, the Congress, ruled in the center. It also ruled most state governments. In 1957 it lost power in Kerala, in 1967 in a few northern states. But broadly the Congress was in power in the center throughout and in most states. So it was much more dominant than the BJP is now. Or even more dominant than the BJP is now. So in 1975, Nehru's daughter Indira Gandhi imposed the emergency, where all the political opponents were put in jail. The press was curtailed, human rights activists were arrested, and so on. And of course, you know quite a lot about this through your studies. But I tell you a story about the emergency, where an editor of the New York Times called A.M. Rosenthal came to India in the emergency. And this man, A.M. Rosenthal, had been the correspondent in Delhi in the 1950s. So he knew about Nehru and his reputation. And then he comes to the 1970s and he sees the fear and the insecurity and the worry and everyone in jail. And he goes back and writes an article. He says the joke in Delhi is, Nehru was jailed by the British many times, as you know. And he wrote 3 books in jail. One is called Glimpses of World History, which is letters he wrote to his daughter. So A.M. Rosenthal writes, when he comes to the emergency, he goes back to America and says, the joke in Delhi is, Nehru is in jail again and writing letters to his daughter about the virtues of freedom and democracy. Okay, now, so that was the emergency and people were in jail. And in jail was every major and minor leader of the opposition. And at that stage, the opposition to the Congress party was of different kinds. It was not one single party. Like today, the opposition to BJP is many parties. There were 3 main, there were really 4 major opponents of the Congress party. One was the Jansangh, which is the precursor to today's BJP. So I need not tell you much more about it, because since you've grown up with the BJP, you know what the BJP stands for. Conservative in family values, the idea that India is a Hindu society and so on. The second party that opposed the Congress was Swatantra Party, which is the first free market party in India. The third party that opposed the Congress was the socialists, not the communists, but the socialists. I mean, they were Jayaprakash Narayan, who was, of course, the great leader of the anti-emergency movement, came from the socialist tradition. And the fourth group that opposed the Congress opposed Indira Gandhi, what was called Congress O. In 1969, Indira Gandhi split the Congress, and some half went with the Congress O and half stayed with her. So these 4 opposition groups were in jail, and they merged to form the Janata Party. And in 1977, because of the excesses of the emergency, when elections were surprisingly held, Indira Gandhi lost and the Congress lost and the Janata Party won. And the Janata Party was united by its opposition, personal opposition to Indira Gandhi. That was, of course, there were these 3 or 4 fragments. But beyond the personal opposition to the politician who had jailed them, there was also an ideological opposition to Nehru. So the Jansangh had always believed that Nehru was anti-Hindu, that he was a Muslim appeaser, that he was a soft ruler who gave away Kashmir, who was weak on China. So that was the Jansangh had always opposed Nehru ideologically. Swatantra Party had also opposed Nehru ideologically because they felt Nehru had promoted what the founder of Swatantra Rajagopalachari called the license permit quota raj, that he had stifled innovation and entrepreneurship. And the socialists opposed Nehru because they felt that Nehru was a upper class anglicized man who did not really represent the masses. You know, Lohia, Ram Manohar Lohia, who was a very brilliant, charismatic leader of the socialists, really, you know, thought Nehru was really an Englishman and upper caste, speaking English. You know, Lohia, by the way, detested the game of cricket also. So he disliked Nehru for playing cricket in the annual MP's match. So here you have these three groups who were opposed to Indira Gandhi personally because she had jailed them, but were opposed to Nehru's ideology. The Jansan because they saw him as a Muslim appeaser, the Swatantra Party because they saw him as a maniacal centralizer who had stifled the market, and the socialists who saw him as an anglicized elite, you know, deracinated anglicized elite. So here they are in 1977, they've come to power after 30 years out of power. And this is when you could say, the knocks on Nehru's reputation. The fact that three groups, each with decades of historic ideological reservation or opposition to Nehru's policies, are now in power and can use the state and the instruments of the state, including the NCRT and education, All India Radio, and of course can all of that to begin to start to debunk Nehru, to poke holes in his reputation, to say hey, he was not actually a great golden disc shining in the middle of Delhi. There's all kind of fake metals composed in that disc, you know, all kinds of polluted substances in that disc. So you had so Nehru's reputation starts declining from 1977 onwards, and of course in 1977 I myself was 20, about the 19, about the age of some of you are now. So since then I've seen Nehru's reputation all through my adult life decline. So it starts declining slowly in the 70s, in the late 70s, 80s, 90s, and after 2014 there's a dramatic precipitous fall because in some ways the BJP hated Nehru much more intensely than the Swatantra Party or the Socialists, because the Swatantra Party and the Socialists actually come from the Congress-led freedom struggle. So they had some respect for Nehru because of his sacrifice in the freedom struggle, because of his personal honesty, because of his long terms in prison, but they disagreed with his ideology. But from 2014, you have the one Indian political party and political ideology that had the most reason to detest Nehru. And of course, there's also a personal element to it. I mean, Vajpayee never had the kind of visceral personal animosity towards Nehru that the people in power now have. So, after 2014, the debunking of Nehru is steady, systematic, unrelenting, and carries on. And of course, it takes some extremely vulgar forms in social media. I mean, there are lies about Nehru that he was a Muslim. Then of course, there's stuff about the fact that they can't abide the fact that Nehru had women friends. So there are all kinds of photoshopped images, and sometimes not photoshopped. Nehru lighting a cigarette for a female friend becomes a sign of how debased and degraded and anti-national he was. Right? So, and of course, at the ideological level, renaming of things, the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library becomes blah, blah, and so on and so forth. So, and of course, this delegitimizing of Nehru, this systematic attack on Nehru is not enabled but facilitated. It would have happened anyway because the profound ideological dissonance between what Nehru stood for and what Narendra Modi and his party stand for. But this delegitimization, this decertification is aided by the fact that the Congress party is still in the control of Nehru's descendants. Right. Now, I'll say one last thing, and then come to the last part of my talk will be about how I assess Nehru. But before I come to that, having talked about the extraordinarily high noon of Nehru's reputation and how it's fallen since his death, I want to say one last thing, just to a factual correction to WhatsApp history, which is important in this regard. Nehru himself had no intention or desire or wish or hope that Indira Gandhi would succeed him as Prime Minister. What is called the Congress First Family Dynasty was started by Indira Gandhi. Nehru clearly, in the last year of his life, when he fell sick, identified Shastri as his successor. There was an earlier moment in 1958 when Indira Gandhi became president of the Congress, but after that she retreated into private life. And in March 1964, 2 months before Nehru died, Indira Gandhi was thinking of moving to England to be with her children because her 2 sons were in, her marriage was estranged, she was close to her kids, and she wanted to be like many Indian parents. My 2 kids are currently in England and I miss them terribly too. I'm not going to move there, but sometimes I feel I should move there to be close to them. So I can sympathize with Indira Gandhi. So she wanted to move. She wrote to a close friend saying, Sanjay is there and he doesn't have a job, and maybe I think I should move. So Nehru, if her father wanted her to be Prime Minister, would be talking like this. What happened was, Nehru died, Shastri, who was his designated successor, became Prime Minister, and suddenly within a year and a half, Shastri died. And there were these 2 successive losses, and the Congress High Command, composed of 6 too clever by half men, thought that they would put Indira Gandhi as Nehru's daughter and manipulate her. And of course, she turned the tables on them. And once she consolidated power, she decided that her son would succeed her. So Sanjay Gandhi was brought into politics by Indira Gandhi, was made her more or less her second in command during the emergency. In 1980, he was General Secretary of the party when she was re-elected, when the Congress re-elected. When Sanjay Gandhi died in June, Rajiv Gandhi, whose only interest was flying planes, was brought into politics. And then of course, you have Sonia Gandhi and Rahul Gandhi and Priyanka Gandhi. So I think this is important factual correction to WhatsApp history. The dynasty, repugnant as it is, was created by Indira Gandhi. However, there is a direct biological lineage, and the only claim that Rahul Gandhi has to being in politics is that he is Jawaharlal Nehru's great grandson, and there is a secondary claim that he is Indira Gandhi's grandson. There is a tertiary claim that he is Rajiv Gandhi's son. But and if you see the statements made by Sonia or Rahul or Priyanka, they are always claiming legitimacy in the family line. So that helps the BJP. So the point is that, notwithstanding the fact that for ideological reasons, the BJP under Narendra Modi would always have reservations about Nehru and what he stood for, the fact that the Congress party, their main opponents, are controlled by Nehru's descendants, makes the case stronger. They can say, oh, this is only a bloody family firm. They're all the same type right now. Okay, now I want to just, so I want to make it clear that do not confuse Nehru with his descendants. He had no intention or desire or hope. It was the wildest fantasy. He wouldn't have thought that the Congress party today would be controlled by his family, because it wasn't in his own lifetime. Right. Now, I want to, in the last part of my talk, say a little bit about how I assess Nehru as a historian. So, just for the sake of convenience, when he was Prime Minister, I'm not going to talk about Nehru as a freedom fighter. He was the Bradman of the Congress in the 30s and the 40s. He brought many young people, particularly women and people of South India to the Congress. He was a wonderful writer, and unlike every 20th century politician, perhaps the only exceptions being Winston Churchill and Charles de Gaulle, he himself wrote the books that appeared in his name, and his own speeches and his own letters. So I'm not going to talk about all that. I'm going to talk about him as a Prime Minister. What was he like as a Prime Minister? How should we judge Nehru as a Prime Minister? In the 17 years, he was the most influential and important public figure in this country. And it's my assessment, but it's based on many years of research and thinking, so I hope it has some amount of credibility. So I'm happy to discuss and debate whatever I'm going to present before you today. And for convenience, I'm going to judge Nehru's functioning as Prime Minister. Now that it's 60 years and we have certain distance and a lot of data to judge how he was, according to 4 axes, I'm going to judge Nehru's domestic policy, Nehru's foreign policy, Nehru's economic policy, and Nehru's social and cultural policy. And by domestic policy, I mean domestic politics. What kind of Democrat was Nehru? And I think this is in many ways his most important and lasting contribution. He was the chief architect of our democracy. Universal adult franchise. He was the Indian nationalist who pushed most consistently for it. There was a widespread belief that the vote cannot be granted to poor and illiterate people, low caste and people and women. And in the West, if you look at the history of electoral democracy in the West, first only rich men have the vote, the educated men are at the roster, then as the society progresses economically, you have working class men and then women and so on. And it's 150 years after electoral democracy that women get the vote in places like England and France and Germany. Nehru said no, we must have multi-party democracy and we must allow everyone to vote. We must have a functioning parliament. I mean, unlike today, Nehru was always there in parliament, listening to opposition speeches, engaging with them and so on. He respected the independence of the judiciary and the press. He was very clear that institutions such as the judiciary, the bureaucracy, bodies like the Reserve Bank of India, the Election Commission of India, must be staffed by professionals and experts who would do what the constitution mandated them to do. They would not get orders from the Prime Minister's office on how to function. So I think he also treated other Congress leaders and opposition leaders with respect. I mean, you see, for example, if you see his conversation with his chief minister, he continues interaction with his chief minister. I mean, now we are in a situation where the Prime Minister will not meet the Chief Minister of Manipur if he wants to go there, right? Now, so that was one, I think, in terms of as a domestic Democrat, Nehru was not perfect. He made mistakes. There were a couple of laws, for example, freedom of expression in retrospect, that he should have abrogated, that were part of the total legal system. But broadly, he was committed to the idea that this is a multi-party democracy in which there must be internal party democracy. So if the Congress party won an election in Andhra Pradesh, as it usually did, Nehru did not decide who was the chief minister. The Congress legislators of Andhra Pradesh did. So democracy within the Congress party, democracy outside, and independence of institutions. Now, but there was one great failure, two great failures. When you talk about Nehru as a Democrat, there were two great failures which I think must be acknowledged. One great or substantial failures. One was the dismissal of the government in Kerala in 1959. So in 1957, the communists won in Kerala. And there was agitation against them by the Congress party. The Congress party was so used to being in power that they were unhappy. There was a street protest. And then President's rule was invoked and the communist government was dismissed. And some defenders of Nehru tend to blame other people. Indira Gandhi was then temporarily president of the Congress for 1 year. Govind Ballabh Pant was home minister. But he was prime minister, and even if he got this advice, he should have seen it set a bad precedent, because now, what he did in Kerala in 1959 has become much more common. Central interference with state government, but that was one weakness in Nehru's democratic legacy. The second weakness, which I may come to later, was we can ask the question, why didn't he train a successor? Why did he train a second generation of leaders? I mean, Gandhi, his great mentor, trained so many leaders. Gandhi trained Nehru, Patel, Rajaji, Kamaladevi Chattopadhyay, Sarojini Naidu, and so on and so forth. But, so that's, in a sense, the dismissal of the Kerala government is the one major blot on Nehru's democratic reputation. Let me move then from domestic politics to international politics and consider Nehru's foreign policy. And here interestingly, he was foreign minister while being prime minister. He took foreign policy very seriously. Among all the Congress leaders, he had the most international kind of approach. And one of his ideas, which was a novel innovation, was to stay non-aligned in the Cold War. So in 1945, the Second World War ends. In 1947, India becomes independent. By 1949, the Cold War has begun. And you have two superpowers, America and the Soviet Union, each cultivating allies. Not dissimilar to America and China today, except that there was a symmetry. Today, China is not yet as important economically and politically as America. Then there was a kind of symmetry, because Russia had played a crucial role in winning the Second World War, And there was a great fascination with the Russian Revolution. So in Asia and Africa and in Latin America, America and Russia were looking for allies. And they wanted loyal allies. And Nehru had this very clear idea, and in my view, clever idea of staying non-aligned. And the non-aligned movement was started by Nehru along with Sukarno of Indonesia and a few other people, but he articulated it most consistently. So, and this allowed India, by staying non-aligned, it allowed India room to maneuver, to take aid from both sides. For example, our IITs, which is one of Nehru's great contributions, was set up by the Americans and the Russians and the Germans, and to play a mediating role in global conflict. It would have been hazardous to take sides. Pakistan took sides in the Cold War. It identified with America, with all kinds of consequences, that later became, negative for Pakistan. And also, if you look at Nehru's contribution to international politics, one forgotten and very admirable aspect of Nehru's contribution, which is forgotten now, was his support to the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. Which is a great moral campaign of that time. And in the 1950s, and 60s, where all the Western nations were supporting the racist regime in South Africa, Nehru supported the anti-apartheid struggle. And there were two great leaders of the anti-apartheid struggle. There were actually three: Mandela, whom you all know about, Walter Sisulu, and Oliver Tambo. Mandela and Walter Sisulu were imprisoned in the early 60s. But Oliver Tambo escaped. So Mandela and Sisulu told Oliver Tambo, Tambo, we are likely to be jailed, so you should go out and campaign for the rights of Africans and colored people. And Tambo, all through the 60s and 70s, traveled the world, the Western nations, the UN, the UN, talking about the need to end apartheid. And he traveled on an Indian passport, which Nehru wrote him. These were the things that are not known about his contribution to the anti-apartheid struggle. So, the idea of non-alignment was not just moral, it was, I think, very clever and strategic, and allowed us to not take sides, which I think helped us in the long run. But there was a great failure in Nehru's foreign policy, and this is well known, with regard to China. He was naive and trusting about China. He made a disastrous error in choosing Krishna Menon as his defense minister, who really didn't, who did nothing to equip us militarily to prepare for a Chinese threat, even though, Nehru had been warned several times by people in his own party that Krishna Menon was the wrong man. So his foreign policy record, just as his domestic policy record was marred by the dismissal of the Kerala government in 1959, his foreign policy record, broadly admirable, was marred by the underestimation of China. The kind of somewhat naive and even credulous idea that there could be a pan-Asian solidarity and India and China were kind of bound by some kind of Asian brotherhood. Okay, I'll come next to economic policy. Now, this is an area in which Nehru has faced the fiercest criticism. This license permit quota Raj business. However, this criticism of Nehru for imposing a command and control economy is anachronistic. It's made by the virtue of hindsight. Remember, India had been colonized by a multinational company, the East India Company. There was natural suspicion of private capital. Also, indigenous private capital did not have the money and resources to invest in infrastructure. In 1946, India's 6 leading industrialists, including the Birlas, the Tatas, the Srirams and some others, came up with something called a Bombay Plan, which said India needs a mixed economy in which the state must play the leading role in infrastructure, in power, in steel, in roads, because we don't have the money. And it must protect us from foreign competition. So, Nehru's economic policy, in many ways, was a product of its time. In the late 1940s and early 50s, we needed to protect ourselves from external competition. We needed to nurture domestic industry. We needed the state to invest in infrastructure. The IITs are one aspect of what Nehru did. Probably he could have, by the late 1950s, when India was more self-confident, maybe he could have started liberalizing. But broadly, the criticisms of Nehru's economic policy, I think, are anachronistic and misplaced. The time to liberalize would have been the 60s, and in many ways, Indira Gandhi compounded the problem, because by the late 1960s, other Southeast Asian countries like Thailand, South Korea, Taiwan were liberalizing and reaping the benefits, and at that stage, the top Indian economists, including Jagdish Bhagwati, were urging a policy of trade liberalization, and I think Indira Gandhi deserves much more criticism than Nehru for the economic mistakes we made in the first few decades of independence. I'll end the last part, the last sector by which I want to assess Nehru, having talked about domestic politics, international politics, economic policy, is social and cultural policy. And I think in many ways this is, along with democracy, Nehru's greatest contribution, the nurturing of a pluralist ethos. Again talking about social media, many of you would know about this debate that has been ongoing since 2014 to the effect that India would have been better served and would have been a happier, more prosperous place if Gandhi had chosen Patel instead of Nehru as Prime Minister. All of you are aware of this. Now, Gandhi made a choice, but why did he choose Nehru or Patel? I think we have to explain that. And this has been explained by other historians much better than me, including Rajmohan Gandhi, who's written the only good biography of Patel actually in print today. And the reason Gandhi chose Nehru over Patel as his successor was the following. Firstly, he was much younger. Okay. So, Patel anyway died in 1950. So, if he had become Prime Minister in 2 years, he would have been dead. But that was not the main reason. The main reason Gandhi chose Nehru as his successor was that over anyone else in the Congress, there were many remarkable leaders in the Congress. Even there was not just Patel, there was Rajaji, there was Azad, there was Kripalani, all towering figures. Why did Gandhi choose Nehru? Because after Gandhi, Nehru was the most Indian of Indians. And what do I mean by that? Nehru was a Hindu trusted by Muslims, a man who campaigned for equal rights for women, and a North Indian who was admired in South India. And this is very clear in why, like Gandhi, he was not parochial. Patel was a Gujarati male. Raja Gopalachari was a Tamil male. Azad was a great Muslim scholar, but typecast as a great Muslim scholar. So Rajmohan Gandhi argues this very persuasively, and it's very clear that he saw this. And if you see, universal adult franchise, equal rights for women, the reform of Hindu personal laws, regard for religious pluralism, Nehru's absolute commitment that even if Pakistan denied its Hindu and Sikh minorities rights, India would not do that to its Muslim and Christian minorities, reaching out to South India. I mean, this is something, as someone who lives in South India, I have become to appreciate more and more because of what has been happening in recent decades. So I think that is in many ways not just why Gandhi chose Nehru. That is Nehru's distinctive stamp on what it means to be an Indian, that he articulated, he nurtured and articulated a compelling idea of India, culturally inclusive, socially tolerant, and absolutely opposed to inequalities on gender and caste, but respectful of diversity, religion, language, region, and so on and so forth. Okay, now, but when it comes to Nehru's social and cultural policy, and though I've talked about why I feel it was broadly admirable, there was one great failure, and that was the sphere of primary education. Nehru was enchanted by science, and I think that's why the IITs and the TIFR and those, of course, we are all benefiting from them. But he laid inadequate emphasis on primary education. And this is something, as a follower of Gandhi, who believed in the last person, he should have understood. I mean, in 1947, when we became independent, India had a reservoir of enormous energy and enthusiasm among hundreds of thousands of young nationalists who had been jailed, who wanted to contribute to the country, not like today, or later on when there was cynicism and careerism abroad. Here was Indians all over, of men, women, Hindus, Muslims, high caste, low caste, North Indians, South Indians, all wanting to build a new country. And a lot of this, and also a very capable civil service, not a compromised civil service as it later became. And Nehru, in many ways, and people told him, there were people who said, this money you are spending on steel mills, if you spend on primary education instead, it would have a much more salutary long-term effect on social and economic growth. And I think Nehru was often blamed for the wrong things. He could not have adopted a free market policy after we had been ruled for 200 years by a multinational corporation. He could not have solved the Kashmir problem, and I can give you a whole 5-hour lecture on why it was too complicated for one man to solve. But primary education, I think, in some many ways, is Nehru's great unacknowledged failure. Okay, now, I should really, I think I should, do some more, speak for 10 minutes or so?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. I wanted to make some concluding remarks. But let me say before I make those concluding remarks that the greatest paradox of, you remember the statement I made about Andre Bete's statement about the reversal of the biblical injunction in terms of, you think of Nehru's reputation. In many ways, the greatest paradox of modern Indian history is that every act of the father that nurtured, every act of Nehru that nurtured a liberal ethos was undone by Indira Gandhi. He promoted an opposition, Mr. Gandhi's quenched it. Nehru respected the press, Indira Gandhi muzzled it. Nehru allowed autonomy to the executive, Indira Gandhi thought of committed civil servants and judges. And that continues, the kind of politicization of civil service and judiciary, the attacks on the press that Indira Gandhi began have continued and intensified ever since. Right. Nehru's Congress was a decentralized democratic organization, Indira Gandhi's Congress was only one person, and so on and so forth. Now, because for no fault of Nehru's, the party he gave his whole life to is still controlled by his family, and objective assessment of Nehru is made much more difficult by this fact. I've often been asked, many people have asked me to write a biography of Nehru, and I've said I'll have to wait till Rahul and Priyanka Gandhi exit politics. And I'm 65, so it's not going to happen in my lifetime, right? But maybe after I'm gone, some younger scholar will, provide a really serious, rigorous, and credible assessment of what Nehru meant. I provided you just my views, for whatever they mean, whatever they stand for. Now, but my views as a historian and as a citizen is that on the whole, Nehru was good for India. I talked about his faults, we can talk about other faults. But I think because we had him as Prime Minister in that first formative decade of independence, we stayed united and stayed democratic. I mean, we contrast our India's fate with other countries, not just Pakistan, but Indonesia or Sri Lanka and so on. You can see, how in many ways we were lucky to have Nehru. I'll just make my last comment and then I'll stop. And that's about, pose the question, did Nehru stay on too long? S. Gopal, who's written a 3-volume biography of Nehru, which is very well researched, but errs a little bit on the side of hagiography, but very well researched, says in his book that if Nehru had died in 1958, he would have been remembered as the greatest statesman of the 20th century. So what did he do in his first decade as Prime Minister? He oversaw the uniting of India, along with Patel and Ambedkar and many other people, but he was the chief architect, the nurturing of democratic ethos, the building of industrial infrastructure, the creation of the IITs, enhancing India's moral standing. But after 58, the problem started. In 59, the Kerala government was dismissed. In 1960-61, the problem with China started. Then there was evidence of corruption in the Congress. So, as Gopal said, if he had died in 1958, he would have been remembered as the greatest statesman of the 20th century. Now, I'm not agreeing with that judgment, but I'm certainly saying that two things. One, that maybe it's interesting that he didn't retire. I mean, was it personal vanity? Did he think did he not stay? In 1958, after 2 terms in power, he thought maybe I should give up and make way for someone else. And he went to Kashmir and took a holiday. And he came back and decided to stay on. And it's not clear why he decided to stay on. Did he think he had to serve the country? Did his sycophants tell him कि आपके बिना देश नहीं चलेगा? You never know, right? But it's interesting that 1958 is when he thought that maybe I need to go. And perhaps he stayed on too long. I think, of course. But given all of that, I do feel, and this is where I end, that this is quite common among historical figures, that they overvalue while they are alive, especially when there's so much power and they are not only very charismatic, but they have the power, like one person who was clearly overvalued and valued when he was alive and is now being dumped on is Nelson Mandela. South Africans are now not very, as adulatory about Nelson Mandela as they were even 10 or 20 years ago. And sometimes this revaluing happens inevitably. There's a larger than life figure who's identified with the country, but in Nehru's case, I just said this, I'll open it up for discussion, that while he was maybe granted excessive deference and adulation while he was alive, the venomous demonization of Nehru that started in the 1980s and has rapidly accelerated and has now reached a crescendo is, I think, absolutely unjustifiable. I mean, it deserves much better than that. Thank you.